Well, greetings to you. Today I'd just like to offer a few words about wartime propaganda. And war propaganda is a little bit like radiation. You don't know it's happening to you. You can't feel it. You can't smell it. But it's happening. And before you realise, it's too late. It's too late. Now, wartime propaganda is counterintuitively a rather recent phenomenon because, although historians might disagree a little, one might argue that you didn't really need wartime propaganda from going as far back as the Punic Wars until the War of the Spanish Succession. For the simple reason, why would that be? Well, war propaganda there is to stoke up the public. It's to stoke up the common man. And if the king or the monarch or the emperor said we're going to war, the common man didn't have a say anyway. And wars were fought mainly by professional soldiers and professional seamen. So you weren't in any great danger of being conscripted. So the propaganda side of it wasn't really necessary until significantly later. And different historians will take a different view, but I would argue perhaps that it began in the Napoleonic era, when Great Britain had to fund a lot of the Napoleonic wars, and if they weren't actually fighting them or keeping a fleet at sea, they were having to fight other members of the Allies with gold. And for that, of course, as every schoolboy knows, income tax was invented. So you had to have a form of propaganda to keep up the Napoleonic War going because people didn't really want to pay the tax to pay for it. So you had to have Napoleon Bonaparte, he's a wicked man, he's an evil man, so on and so forth, which was quite easy to propagandize because he was some of those things anyway, and propaganda is always quite effective if there's an element of truth in it. So we saw really perhaps the first propaganda with mothers telling their children if they didn't behave, Boney would come and get them. Now, before I just shoot through other examples of wartime propaganda, I'd just like to talk about the great master of propaganda. The great master of propaganda was the evil genius, of course, Dr. Goebbels, who was a master of propaganda, and he was a truly evil man, but a very clever man. And if you Google him up, you will find he had some fundamental ideas about propaganda. They were totally fundamental. He said you can't break the rules, or otherwise your propaganda won't work. And his golden rules were: you must not have dissent. There must be no room for dissent. You have the establishment view and absolutely nothing else. Nothing else is allowed under any circumstances. You must also appeal to emotion. There's no point in appealing to perhaps fact or figures and so on, or common sense or anything like this. You have to appeal to emotion, because if you want to get the many-headed stirred up, you have to appeal to their emotion. And there's all sorts of different ways of doing that. And he also said if you can get people on side with the establishment who are prestigious people, if you will, and prestigious people sort of have varied over the centuries, of course, what is deemed to be prestigious or not. We now have a celebrity culture, for example, but it could in the past have been an aristocratic or militaristic prestigious group of people. So these are the fundamental things. You must stamp out any dissent, and you must appeal to emotion. And if you fast forward a little bit from the Napoleonic Wars, you come to a little known war, a largely forgotten war, and that's the Anglo-American War of 1812. And nobody really can quite remember how it started or what it was all about, but it's sometimes referred to as Madison's War, President Madison. And it was actually the war aim, although I never met a fellow officer of the United States services, many of whom I served, who actually knew what the war aim was. But it was actually to kick the British out of Canada. That was the war aim. And then, of course, you had your propaganda side of life actually weighed in there, because a lot of people didn't want a war with Great Britain because it was the most powerful power on the planet, and it was a great trading nation, and of course everybody was going to lose quite a lot of money if we had war. Now, with the consent largely of the Madison establishment, all the editors and editorials of the newspapers on the eastern seaboard were stamped out. There couldn't be any dissent, and Madison knew that dissent was going to be stamped out, and lots of editors of newspapers were actually murdered on their papers. The offices of their papers were burnt to the ground, and one editor in Baltimore was actually tortured to death in his own office. So in a very crude attempt, it was very, very crude indeed, of course, but we knew that dissent had to be stamped out. Then if you fast forward again to 1853, you get the Crimean War, the Anglo-French war against the Russians. And we see that that's quite interesting because we had to stoke up the propaganda there by building up hatred for the bear. Plus ça change, one might almost say. And we stoked it up, and of course we had the song Jingo, by Jingo we don't want to fight, but by Jingo if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. So you have this interesting Jingoism that came about, which was sung in the music halls, because wars are very expensive and the Crimea was very expensive. We had to stir up the population. We had to stir them up to hate the Russians, so we'd pay for a largely futile and ridiculous war in the Crimea. And a little bit later, of course, we come to the war in America, where the northern states invaded the Confederacy in order to stop them seceding from the Union. And honest Abe Lincoln understood very well about the importance of propaganda and information and dissent. So he suspended the rule of habeas corpus to make sure that all the editors who didn't want an internal war with the southern states, because it would be expensive in both money and lives, indeed it was 600,000 American dead and the same number maimed and wounded. It was a very futile and ridiculous war. And the editors of those newspapers were actually all locked up. And that's what happens to democracy when you start to get wars coming along on the horizon. Democracy goes out of the window, and anybody who dissents gets locked up, and we've seen that on many occasions. And then you have perhaps where false flag things come in. That's the American war against the Spanish towards the end of the 19th century. And one of the ships blew up. One of the American warships blew up. The Maine, and everybody said, oh my goodness me, it's been some kind of Spanish torpedo, they've blown up the ship, the nose nasty Spanish. And we start to see the first headlines coming out, do the Spaniards eat babies? Honestly, I shit you not, have a look. We think the Spaniards eat babies. And this is another way of rounding everybody up, getting everybody stirred up to hate the Spanish. And then, of course, we had possibly one of the greatest wins for propaganda in the history of mankind, which was when Great Britain joined the Franco-Russian alliance in order to fight the Germans. There was no treaty obligation to do that at all, although some amateur historians believe that there was. There wasn't. It was a tripartite treaty. Germany, France and Great Britain. As soon as the Germans invaded Belgium, of course, it became void. And if you look at the transcripts from Parliament at the time, you'll find that no political party, neither the Tory party nor the Liberals in power, made any attempt to argue that it was a treaty-driven obligation, but it was a moral obligation. And of course, here we come back to the Goebbels view that you have to have emotion. So they stirred up the emotions. How did they do that? Well, the nasty Germans were bayoneting civilians and eating babies and all the rest of it all over again. And of course, there was a tiny germ of truth, in fact, because that they did burn the Louvain Middle Ages library to the ground, and they did raze one or two villages to the ground. And propaganda is always useful if there's a tiny element of truth. But of course, we got into that war, and even today, historians are wondering how the hell we got into war, which was nothing what's to do with us. We had 1 million British Empire war dead and about 2 million more maimed very badly. And people look back on that war and still can't understand what it was all about. And of course, there was another war in 1939, so it didn't actually do very much good. And this is the trouble with warfare. Almost nobody ever wins wars. Nobody ever wins. It doesn't matter whether you think you won, you find a little bit later on that you haven't really won. So wars are nearly always, not always, but nearly always a complete waste of time. Now, if you fast forward again, and let's bring ourselves up, as we're talking about propaganda, to the American war in Vietnam. It's interesting that the war in Vietnam Okay, you might argue that militarily it was impossible to win, but it was actually certainly impossible in a democratic country like the United States to win that war without the support of mainstream media, without the support of the people. And so dissent was allowed, by default perhaps, but dissent was allowed. And of course, the war was lost when you lost the public support for it, because it's the public support for it who are actually paying for it through taxation and, of course, a form of conscription, the draft, as they called it. Now, the Americans knew that they'd made a mistake and they were never going to make this mistake again. They learned that from the Vietnam War. They knew that if you're going to have any kind of war, you mustn't have dissent. You must have complete and total control of mainstream media, the newspapers, TV, everything. Dissent is not allowed. You have to crush dissent. And the Americans learned that from Vietnam. And with the facilitating CIA, who actually control the media probably since the Vietnam War in the West. And if you don't take my word for it, take President Kennedy's word for it, because he wanted to get rid of it, because he knew this to be the case. He knew that the free press in the West had been corrupted, as indeed it is corrupted today. And so it's rather interesting that we see, do we not, this situation where without dissent, with no form of dissent, you can get away with absolute murder, literally murder. So we've seen the Americans go for regime change in Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, with hundreds, Yemen, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, millions of civilian casualties and deaths, with almost no dissent at all in the Western media. It's almost no. They've gone on and on and on doing this now for decades without any dissent. And the British press as well will release the CIA press release immediately without any checking at all. Doesn't matter. It turns out later it's false flag. The whole thing's a lot of nonsense. It's pure crude propaganda. But you'll find if it's on American TV, it will pop up on our TV screens and Western European TV screens within the hour. No question. Dissent isn't allowed. Dissent is verboten. And of course, it doesn't have to be warfare, does it? It can be lots of other things. It can be climate change. It can be mass medication. It can be all these things. Dissent is not allowed. The establishment view is gripped, and there's nothing you can do about it. And of course, the other great thing that the evil genius Dr. Goebbels said was, you have to repeat the lie. You have to repeat and repeat and repeat long enough, straightforwardly enough, so that it becomes received wisdom. After a while, it doesn't become challenged because people have heard it so many times that they actually start to believe it. And so this is really what we're seeing. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this now is because we're seeing all this propaganda without any form of dissent again. And we're seeing the little blue and yellow flags pop up everywhere. Those little blue and yellow flags. Now, they're either people who were in the Royal Horse Artillery, whose colours are the same, or people who hail from Provence, yellow and blue, rather charming colours. But what I would do, and I would counsel you that propaganda is a very dangerous game when it comes to warfare. It's a very dangerous game. So when you're waving by proxy your yellow or your blue flag, yellow and blue flag, when you're doing that, try and remember back, will you? Try and remember back to 1914 when they were waving their national flags in London, Berlin and Paris, and see what good came of it. Not much good came of it. And again in 1861 when they were waving the Star-Spangled Banner and all this kind of thing, not much good came of it. Indeed, not much good ever comes of these nationalistic demonstrations of war. So just be careful. Just be careful. Do not believe everything you hear or read when it comes to these matters. There is a reason you're not having a dissenting view, or a dissenting view has been rubbed out. Is because you're probably not being told the truth, or you're certainly not being told the whole truth. Think about it. Well, greetings to you. As you know, social media was a wonderful invention so that we could all communicate with each other and share our views, and share views that aren't necessarily in line with the establishment, the global establishment, which is run mainly by banks and big pharma. So I've been doing my best to do that, but I am increasingly being shadow banned or taken down, and so are many others. So beware of that, and I will be tagging anything I do in the future with various sources and various channels, so that you will know, well, I've been censored from this, but I've been censored, but you can find it somewhere else. So the whole thing can continue. And I think some of these new channels, which aren't owned by the establishment or influenced by the establishment, banks and big pharma and all the rest, you'll be able to follow the facts. And that doesn't mean fact checkers, of course, which are owned by the establishment. So I just thought I'd give you the heads up on that. And thank you for your sponsorship and your support. I thank you for it. Without you and the information that sometimes you people send me, I couldn't continue. Thank you again. As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I'll automatically share it with you. So surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.